Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. These stories were first published around April 1910. They are about Lord Lister called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant among all thieves. He is the terror of usurers and moneylenders, robs them of their possessions by his wiles, protecting beleaguered innocence and supporting the needy. Man of honor in all respects. He persuaded that many abuses, protected by law, continue to proliferate with impunity. Every effort is made to apprehend Lord Lister, called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant of thieves. Reward, £1,000 sterling.
Lord Lister, the Knight's Theft in the Royal Palace. By Kurt Matchell and Theo Blakenzy. Chapter 1. Detective White. Detective White entered Scotland Yard with a young lady and asked to see Detective Baxter. "This young lady," he said, pointing to the pretty girl, who hid her face behind a thick veil, "has been pursued by several gentlemen, who thought they had every right to harass innocents. It took me a lot of effort to protect her." Baxter turned to the young lady. "What is your name?" "Ellen Crofton." "Good. And where do you live?" "In Bromley." The inspector noted the name of this street, and then muttered to himself, "What good can come of Bromley?" Then again to the girl. "What does your father do?" "He was an officer in the Indian Army, but he has been running a business for some years." "So you are impoverished?" The girl blushed at those words. "Now tell me, White, what happened?" "I was walking down James Street, began White, because that street belongs to my ward." "It's one of our main streets," interrupted the inspector. "And further?" "Suddenly I heard a cry for help. I went for it. Suddenly the door of a house was torn open, and this young girl flew out with a dead white face. The darkness was favorable to its pursuers, and the lords, if the bad boys can lay claim to that name. Keep your comments to yourself, White. Only great people live in James Street." "I think so too, Inspector. So those villains." "I just told you there that you must speak in a different tone." Then those wonderful gentlemen ran down the street, grabbed her, threw her to the ground, and while one of them kept her mouth shut, the others tried to drag her back into the house. I rushed over and ordered them to let go of the young lady. "The wretches, I mean the gentlemen," replied with a mocking laugh. Then I made short trial, threw some of them to the ground and put the others to flight. One of the fellows, I mean the gentleman, put his knife in my arm. I couldn't get hold of him and he fled." "What kind of a house was that where that story took place?" "It was number 39 on James Street." Baxter nervously opened the thick address book. "Good Lord," he stammered, "3 of the foremost clubs in London are based there, one of which belongs to a prince, and you played so against those gentlemen?" White replied, "But I'm just telling you there, Inspector, that the bandits—" "You're incarcerated for a day, White. You've been very careless again. You got involved in a case with which the police have absolutely nothing to do. If more than a dozen men attack an unprotected girl, the police must get involved," White claimed. The inspector turned again to the young lady. "How did you get into that clubhouse?" "I don't know." The inspector smiled grimly. "Those are not answers. You must tell the truth. What have you to do with those gentlemen?" "I went for a walk in Hyde Park this afternoon," she replied. "It was getting dark when I suddenly felt unwell. I was still able to walk to a bank, where I sank unconscious. When I came to myself again, I was in a strange house, and surrounded by a number of young men who were insulting me. I pushed them aside and fled. The rest you know. And do you think I believe that fiction? It's not a fabrication." She straightened up with a proud gesture. "You can go, ma'am. I advise you, However, not to provoke such pleasantries in the future. Just be careful that the police don't find terms to check your life a little more closely. The detective saw that the girl under her veil turned deathly white. She faltered. White supported her and whispered to her, "Go now and never try to get in touch with the police again. That's no good for you." She shook his hand gratefully. White called for a higher carriage and a minute later Miss Crofton was gone. The inspector paced the room. When White came back in, Baxter snapped. "White, you've only been employed for 6 months. You're still a rookie. You think you can achieve everything by force and you constantly act against the rules. In neighborhoods like Street James Street, Pall Mall, Regent Street and others, don't worry so much, understand? You have to be a little careful in the streets where London's chiefs live. You've got a lot to learn from us, White. All those private affairs of the rich are none of our business. If there's a crime involved, you see, it's quite another." "Wasn't that a crime, Inspector?" "You're a fool, White." "Thank you. Shouldn't there be an inquiry into how Miss Crofton came into the clubhouse so suddenly? Let us wait and see whether her father takes care of the matter. Perhaps there is a mysterious love story at play here." White shrugged. At the same instant the telephone rang. One of the officers who served her spoke for a long time. Then he said to the inspector, "Sir Jonathan Warman asks for protection." "Sir Warman? The wealthy Irish landowner? I will go there with some men. What is the reason for this request?" "He's afraid his safe will be looted." "So suddenly? How so?" "Raffles has been spotted nearby." "Raffles? Raffles? Indeed Raffles? Guys, that's a great thing. We'll be looking for him in a minute. The guy still drives me crazy. He's said it so many times that it's about time it happened," whispered White. Baxter chose White, whom he praised for his bravery and cool-headedness, and gladly had with him at all times, and 5 more men with whom he set out. He had received many more indications which compelled him to go to aid Sir Warman as soon as possible. "It seems," said Baxter on the way, "that Warman has many powerful personal enemies. For every moment he sends me a threatening letter which he has received. There have been attacks on him twice already. He is a gentleman through and through, and the only charge that can be made against him is that he is too great a Don Juan." "That's not a crime," claimed one of the detectives. "It depends," said White in a low tone. The inspector had understood these words, however. He turned and asked, "Why, White? Aren't rich gentlemen allowed to amuse themselves? You are a wonderful fellow." "That's not what I mean, Inspector," replied White. "What do you mean?" "Well, Inspector, I think those rich gentlemen should amuse themselves in their own circle. Instead of doing that, they always look for their victims where poverty has already done enough harm." The inspector laughed loudly. Everyone else agreed equally loudly. "Do you think, White, that he should date the daughter of the aristocrats? You are a big kid. I'd almost say, dude, you're no good for your job." But here we are at our destination. It was 11 o'clock in the evening. Inspector Baxter and his men entered the large, lavishly furnished home of Sir Jonathan Warman, a well-known sportsman in London, who was in the leading and highly regarded circles there. Sir Warman met him. "Thank you, Inspector, for coming," he said in a deep voice. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, with charming manners. On his rather long neck was a head with broad, somewhat plump features, and a typical Irish nose. If Sir Warman had not been so lavishly dressed and had not such distinguished manners, he might just as well have been taken for one of the lower echelons of the working class. "Imagine, Inspector, what I experienced a few hours ago," cried Woman. "Perhaps a gallant adventure?" "Let the devil take all gallant adventures," exclaimed Sir Warman, who seemed suddenly changed in taste. "Imagine, Inspector, I had a rendezvous at some cafe at 8 o'clock this evening. It doesn't matter which cafe. I go inside, and take a seat in the little room where I expect the lady. 5 minutes later a gentleman comes in. I must say that Raffles is very elegant. Devilishly elegant. And cheeky. I have never seen such a thing. Did Raffles come instead of the lady? How is that possible? If I knew that, I'd be prettier than you. Are you sure it was Raffles? It was Raffles. The fellow gave quite a speech and finally declared to me that I had a. Well, that's not the point. In any case, he has announced to me that he will come to take my money tonight, because I have far too much and it actually belongs to others. What do you say to such logic? I told him I would immediately warn Inspector Baxter. And what did he answer? He laughed and mentioned a multitude of animal names in connection with you. Such an impudent flail. But I have the utmost confidence in you, Inspector. And I won't betray that trust, Baxter replied with appropriate modesty. We will immediately take the necessary measures. You, Sir Warman, may want to guard the room in which your safe is kept. I'll give you Detective White to assist you. Sir Warman looked at White. I like the guy, he said, but I have no time, Inspector, I have an urgent appointment. Your detective will be able to sort that out on his own. As you wish, Sir Warman, I'll go and watch the safe with White. All right, replied the rich man. Baxter gave his directions and the men went to their posts. The safe was in a small room that had 2 doors. One could not come through one door without going up the stairs where a detective was standing. The second door opened into Sir Warman's study. Here are cigars and cigarettes, said Sir Warman, make it as easy as possible for you, I'll be back early tomorrow, and hope all danger has passed. If the devil doesn't play with it again, we'll get the fellow, replied the inspector. It became quiet in the house. Sir Warman had passed away. Baxter and White sat in the den and kept watch over the room where the safe was, through a large glass door, through which one could easily see, as the room was brightly lit, while the 2 men sat in darkness. I'll be hanging if Raffles managed to steal a penny this time, Baxter claimed. White didn't answer. Indeed, while Baxter was sitting next door and had not looked away from the brightly lit room, White had quietly left and was now patrolling the rooms of the house. He looked all around with an inquisitive eye and finally stopped in front of an oak cupboard. That might be the right thing to do, he muttered, because the safe is empty is obvious. He started to open the wooden door with a looper. Hardly had it been opened when a metal plate became visible. I thought so. So that's the safe, he whispered. He made several futile attempts to open this one too. Then he took from his pocket a so-called fire cutter. The instrument was about 2 feet long and, by means of a special arrangement, contained a quantity of gas, through which a flame of extraordinary heat could be developed. The combination of oxygen and acetylene produced a heat of more than 7,000 degrees Celsius. Even the best armor plate could not bear such a temperature. The means which White now used to melt the safe had been used several times by Raffles. After 5 minutes the work was done. The safe had been opened, and with the utmost indifference, as if the whole matter was none of his business, White took the contents out of the cupboard. There was about £5,000 in it. White put £100 back in the cupboard, put the rest with him, and examined by the light of his electric lantern a large briefcase that had been hidden among the banknotes. It contained a suicide note from a sweetheart and a clipped piece from a newspaper. Suddenly White saw that there was a blood stain on the letter. He read the clipped ad. This one read: We commend ourselves in matters of all kinds and request you to favor us, that we may be able to provide for the necessities of life. Alice Forrester and her son, Gerrard Street, London N. White shrugged and held up both papers. Then he went quietly back to the study. Where have you been? Baxter asked. I've made a tour to convince myself that Raffles hasn't been anywhere yet. Then he relieved the inspector, who lay down on the sofa and 5 minutes later had fallen into a deep sleep. White looked at his watch. It is 1 o'clock, he whispered, so I have a few hours left, for I should like to bid Sir Warman farewell personally. Slowly the hours crept by. White hadn't looked at the room where the safe was for a long time. He had sat down at the writing table. Suddenly he heard a cracking sound. He got up and listened. Truly, there was a burglar outside. A young, thin lad of about 17 had pressed an iron bolt between the door, already half opened by a looper, and the instant White caught him the door of the safe opened. The boy reached into the closet. But with a face that breathed the bitterest disappointment, he withdrew his hand. The safe was empty. White now carefully opened the door and entered the adjoining room. The burglar let out a low scream and looked at the detective with wide, glazed eyes. "You're not too brave either, my boy," said White, gently. "How did you get in?" "I hid in the hallway this afternoon." White looked at the boy. He looked emaciated and his hollow cheeks spoke of misery. "Why did you want to steal?" "Oh, it doesn't matter now. Take me with you and everything will be over." "Come, don't be so foolish, and give me a sensible answer. Have you ever stolen more?" "No, never, it's the first time." "I understood that. And why now?" Because my mother dies if she doesn't get better care. And I ain't got nobody like her." "What's your name?" "Harry Forrester." "Harry Forrester? Where do you live, boy?" "In Gerrard Street." So. That is very remarkable." The detective pulled from his pocket £100 note. "You know that, Harry Forrester? That's £100, is that enough in the first place?" The boy did not understand what was happening to him. But with an energetic gesture, White pushed the banknote into his hand, led him through the dark room in which Baxter slept, and spoke. "If one of the detectives asks for you, just say you belong here." The boy nodded. He wanted to thank the detective, but this one repelled him. Just as the thief was about to leave the house, however, the door opened and Sir Warman entered. White quickly pushed his protégé into a dark corner. Seeing the broken open safe, he exclaimed, "I've been robbed. £10,000 have been stolen. Where is the thief? Where is Raffles?" Sir Warman rushed to his study. The boy had taken advantage of the confusion to flee quickly, and Inspector Baxter had woken up in terror. He stood broken-hearted next to Sir Warman. Such a thing had never happened to him before. White would have been watching, and if he hadn't seen Raffles, but White gave the inspector no time to think any further. Slowly he took off his helmet, then he removed the wonderful wig from his head. Calm, he pulled off his tunic and, slowly checking his revolver, and the crowd stunned with terror, said, "I have the honor to introduce myself to you. I am Raffles." Then he turned to Baxter. "I was convinced from the outset that I could learn nothing new in Scotland Yard, but nevertheless I thank you, Inspector, for the trouble you have taken to acquaint me with a few things." Then he turned again to Sir Warman. "How meanly you lie, Sir Warman. There was not a penny in the safe and it would not have been worth the trouble for Raffles to break into it. But my good star did not deceive me this time either. If you'll check your other cash box." "Get him!" roared Sir Warman. "Grab him!" At the same time, he rushed toward Raffles. But this one had thought of everything. He gave Sir Warman a tremendous punch in the stomach, sending it spinning on the ground. Then he flew down the hall and yanked open the door, chased by all the detectives. It was a mad race to the top floor, but on reaching there Raffles climbed the gutter before the eyes of his astonished pursuers and slid down a fire escape with lightning speed. In the next instant he was hidden from the eyes of his pursuers by the darkness. Chapter 2. Horrible Discoveries. Lord Lister looked carefully around the room in which he sat. He had taken off his coat, but was still in full toilet, which he had worn under the tunic. At first he saw nothing, for it was completely dark. No sound was heard. He felt along the wall and turned on the electric light. He was in a lavishly furnished bedroom. On the bedstead lay a silk blanket, and under it slept a young girl, who in her scent slumber had not even been awakened by the light. The blonde hair fell in tight coils over the lace, decorated pillow, The left hand rested on his chest, the right hung limply over the edge of the bed. Gently Lord Lister approached the bed. Now he also saw that there was some disorder in the room. A chair by the bed had been knocked over, a cupboard was broken, a painting on the wall had been destroyed. Horrified, Raffles drew back as he looked at the sleeping one. She was dead. Raffles placed his hand gently on the blanket. Then he saw distinctly dark stripes, which were sharply outlined on the young lady's neck. "So," he whispered, snorting heavily, first intoxicated, then strangled. The first twilight came through the window. Raffles looked again at the unfortunate one who had found such a mysterious death here, and then stepped out. But again he recoiled in the greatest dismay. In the hallway hung the corpse of the maid, who still wore the white cap on her head. "Awful!" exclaims Raffles. He wanted to flee from this place, but then the desire to know more about that horrible crime overcame. Raffles went from one room to another. The house had 7 rooms, all equally lavishly furnished. Raffles found nothing to indicate the murder. In the dressing room alone there was a band that had to be worn around the arm or the knee. It said, "On y soir, qui mal y pense." Below it was written very small, "Ribbon men." He picked up the tape and put it in his hand. Then he left the house. Outside a shield hung over the door, which read, "Madame de Vales." Raffles left. "Cursed," he said, "who thinks ill of it," and hastened to Gerrard Street. After some searching he had found the house in which Mrs. Forrester lived with her son. He wanted to see if the boy had spoken the truth. Lord Lister went up the stairs and knocked on the door, on which hung a business card, with the name, Alice Forrester. When there was no answer, he just went in. He saw a woman of about 35 years old, who could still be called beautiful. She lay in the middle of the ground, in the midst of a great pool of blood, and the blood still flowed from the gaping wound that seemed to have been inflicted on her neck by a sharp dagger. Raffles clenched his fists and staggered back to the door. Even his nerves of steel couldn't withstand as much crime as he'd seen in the last few hours. He controlled himself and knelt down beside the body to inquire whether all life had not yet passed. He got several bloodstains on his clothes, and unfortunately had to conclude that the life spirits of the unfortunate had already left. Why should the woman have been murdered? Raffles wondered. Who would have had an interest in taking her life? What had the unfortunate had done that such a fate should befall her? While Raffles was still pondering, the door opened and entered the boy whom he had surprised in the burglary that night. When he saw the corpse he turned deathly white, and in the next instant his eyes turned to the Lord in frenzied fury. He flew to the table, grabbed a knife, and started to throw himself at the alleged murderer, but he flinched from his revolver. "Leave that gun alone, boy. I am Raffles, and Raffles is not a murderer." The boy now recognized the detective from last night. "Where have you been tonight?" Lord Lister asked him. "I was at home." The boy sobbed violently. "Have you no idea who may have killed your mother?" "No, I haven't." Lord Lister opened drawers and cupboards and took out letters from which he read the life story of the unfortunate woman. Suddenly he asked, "Do you know Sir Warman?" "I have worked in his factory for some time, otherwise I know nothing about him." Lord Lister nodded. Wasn't it remarkable that this woman kept letters from Warman, which were already 17 years old? He left the house and a bitter smile played on his lips. He went to a telephone office and asked to connect with the Detective Superintendent Baxter, in Scotland Yard. The following conversation was held. "Here Baxter. Here Raffles. Hey? Don't make silly jokes. Bad jokes are usually only made by the police. There is a body in Gerrard Street No. 17. Mrs. Forrester was murdered. You see, then, that it would be a great deal better if you did a little more work on the murderers that roam around London, and wasted a little less time tracking me down." "A corpse, you say? And you discovered that?" What are you doing in Gerrard Street? Where are you now? I am presently in a telephone machine, about 5 minutes from Gerrard Street. When you come here, my dear Baxter, you will find me no more. Do not have any illusions about this. But you will have more to do today. In the Pall Mall Street No. 29, second floor to the left, 2 bodies of a lady and her maid have been found. You're fooling us. No matter. 3 corpses in one night? Is it such a miracle, Inspector, if you sleep all night? I told you once more then, Baxter, that you have nothing in common with a detective, but your uniform. If I were Inspector you wouldn't be Raffles. As I am only too convinced, however, that you are the murderer of Mrs. Forrester, I now inform you that I will deliver the fellow within 24 hours. Bonjour. Raffles hung up the microphone. Baxter turned with a curse. That Raffles, he shouted. He raised his hands to heaven. That Raffles. Raffles as a detective. It's ridiculous. He wants to clear London of the killers. He wants to track down the people who slipped through my fingers. May the devil get him. After venting his anger in this way, he ordered 3 detectives to follow him by bicycle. It now went at breakneck speed to the telephone station at Gerrard Street. Have you seen Raffles? The inspector asked the officer who was guarding the telephone booth. Raffles? Yes, Raffles. Not a trace of it. He was here 15 minutes ago. Oh come. It is indeed true. Ah, you don't mean that elegant young man who telephoned, do you? Yes, I mean that. But it's long gone. A neat fellow, if he's Raffles, damn neat. The inspector disappeared, stamping his feet. 5 minutes later he was at the home of Mrs. Forrester landed. The boy sitting there stood up with a somber, hostile look. There's the fellow who committed the murder, shouted the inspector. How did you get here? What are you doing here? Quick, answer, don't think first. How do I get here? The boy replied with a scornful laugh. Do you think that my mother's death leaves me indifferent? Is the dead one your mother? Yes. That doesn't change the case. Where have you been last night? Away. Where to? I will not answer that foolish insinuation. I wasn't home, so I can't be my mother's murderer. That's right. Then prove your alibi. Where have you been last night? In the... He was silent. Would he say he broke into Sir Warman's house? And that he had escaped through the enigmatic intervention of the detective? He was still silent. But Baxter didn't make many compliments. He had the boy bound and taken to the office. And the suspicion cast upon the poor boy by Baxter was compounded when £100 banknote was found on him, of whose provenance he could say nothing. Raffles was sitting in a cafe when he heard the boy had been arrested. I thought so, he muttered. He called a cab and ordered a drive to Attorney Smith, Regent Street. 10 minutes later the carriage stopped. The lawyer was a man of about 32 years of age. There was a scent of perfume in his study. Lord Lister asked him. You are Sir Warman's lawyer, aren't you? Yes. You are known as an able lawyer. You must have read that young Forrester has been taken into custody on suspicion of murdering his mother. Mr. Smith blushed a little when he heard the name. Secure. He then spoke. I hope you're willing to take on the defense of the poor lad. More than that you will make every effort to free him at once. The lawyer looked at his visitor with wide eyes. And why, if I may ask? Because he is innocent. Are you sure? Otherwise I would not have come to you. I know the boy, and I don't love him. So I will not defend him. Is that the only reason to desert the poor boy? And besides, I only defend those who pay me. How much do you want? Mr. Smith thought for a moment. Then he said again, I am not defending the boy. Then you have another reason. Maybe. Not a fair reason, anyway, Mr. Smith. Your attitude strikes me as very doubtful. The lawyer had jumped up. He reached out for the bell that connected the study to the office. But just as quickly Raffles had knocked his hand back. "We need no witnesses," said Lord Lister. "Don't you think you bear some resemblance to me? One might easily mistake you for Raffles." "Raffles? Art thou Raffles?" "That's me." "Help! Help!" "Shut up," said Lord Lister. He had suddenly changed. He stood straight before the lawyer. His eye rested penetratingly on his adversary, as firmly as if he wanted to pierce him. The lawyer was mesmerized, as it were, by those large black eyes, and his raised right arm dropped limp. "Take your hat and coat," the master thief ordered. The lawyer obeyed mechanically. The great unknown did not lose sight of him for a moment. For the first time in a long time he once again made use of the tremendous power he exercised over other persons. He used it. And Mr. Smith was paralyzed, as it were. He came wholly under the influence of the man who stood before him like a statue. Half an hour later, an elegantly dressed gentleman in Scotland Yard asked to see Inspector Baxter. This happened. "My name is Smith," the visitor introduced himself. "Baxter Bow. I'm a lawyer and I live on Regent Street." Baxter bowed again. "How may I serve you?" The lawyer sat down. "Where is young Harry Forrester at this moment?" he asked. "He's still here in Scotland Yard, Mr. Smith." "So. Would you let the boy come here? I should like to ask him a few things, as I am convinced that he is innocent." Baxter smiled. "You certainly want to defend him, Mr. Smith." "Yes, I want that." "That won't be a rewarding task, Mr. Smith." "That's my business, Inspector." Harry Forrester was presented. The detective who had ushered him in stopped to his right. Mr. Smith kept a close eye on the door and exchanged a few petty words with Harry Forrester. Suddenly he sprang up, punched the detective in the chest with both fists, opened the door, and said to Harry Forrester, "Get away, boy." The boy didn't let himself be told twice. In an instant he was round the corner. A fierce struggle now arose between the inspector and the lawyer, who had thus given the boy an opportunity to flee. The detectives came to the aid of the inspector and Mr. Smith was handcuffed. Baxter looked at him sharply and suddenly he exclaimed, "But that's Raffles." "I immediately noticed the resemblance," said one of the detectives. "Of course it's Raffles," said Baxter, "we've got him at last." The handcuffed man had straightened up. "You are mistaken, gentlemen," he said, "I am indeed Advocate Smith." "No, but he's good, he says he's Lawyer Smith," came the voice of many. "I wish to be set at liberty at once, surely you don't want me to charge you?" "Don't play such a comedy, Raffles, we know those tricks," said Baxter. "But I'm Smith." Baxter went to the phone, number 9763, "Ma'am. Am I speaking to Attorney Smith? Here is one who I suspect is Raffles. He claims to be Mr. Smith. A scammer, isn't it?" "Correct. Thank you very much, Mr. Smith." Baxter turned and said to the captive, "Don't play that game any more." "But I am Smith," asserted the prisoner again. "You know what the matter is," he began suddenly, "that fellow sitting there on my desk is Raffles. Make quick work of it, Inspector, I assure you you'll do a good job." Baxter laughed heartily. "Will you let me walk in again, Raffles?" "No, man, you won't succeed this time." The prisoner screamed, howled, and howled, but he didn't give a damn. He was locked in a cell. Mr. Smith, meanwhile, was sitting at his desk in Regent Street. This was not Mr. Smith, however, but Raffles, the great unknown, who had lighted a cigar at his leisure. How beautifully it all went. He had suggested to Mr. Smith that he should go to Scotland Yard in his stead to free the imprisoned Harry Forrester, by force if necessary. Lord Lister had told him how to set it up. There went the phone. It was Baxter who inquired. Then he yelled at a clerk, all mistook him for Mr. Smith, whom he looked exactly like, and had some deeds given to Sir Warman, which he went to study. Another clerk came in. Sir Warman wishes to see you, Mr. Smith. Come in. Sir Warman came in. He did not look at the lawyer, closed the door and sat down at the desk with a broad gesture. Mr. Smith, he began, you are my friend. It seemed that way for at least 7 years. But you are not my friend. You are a bastard and deserve to be kicked out of our club. Raffles was very surprised. What is it, Sir Warman? What ails you? The Irishman flushed with anger. Are you still asking? Didn't you promise me that damned affair with Mrs. Forrester, and now you're going to defend her son? Who told you that? It's in the newspapers. I don't want it, Mr. Smith. You may, you won't, you understand? I don't think about it. But have I paid you £10,000 for it thus far? I want another £5,000 on the spot. You are crazy. Will you then rob me of all my money? Not a penny I can give any more. The alleged lawyer shrugged. I'm sorry, Sir Warman, not a penny less. Sir Warman waved off again. But Smith remained adamant. Finally, Woman put £5,000 on the table. That's the last thing I own, he said. That is not true, Sir Warman. But at least I've got enough loose now. 5,000 and 5,000 is 10,000. What do you mean by that? That I made your safe a little lighter tonight. Warman lost his color. Suddenly he cried out, You are Raffles. Yes, I'm Raffles. Warman wanted to throw himself at the Lord. Lord Lister held a revolver under his nose. Not from your seat. With these words, Lord Lister laid the weapon on the table. His adversary, pale with terror, sank back into the armchair. Warman, however, still followed the master thief's every move. Suddenly he sprang to his feet, quickly grabbed the revolver and held it up to Raffles' nose. On your knees, wretch, you are my prisoner. Raffles laughed. He laughed uncontrollably. But Sir Warman, please don't make such a great fuss for nothing. After all, the weapon isn't loaded. At the same moment a great noise was heard on the stairs. Moments later, Baxter entered with an inspector and Mr. Smith in their midst. There's the wretch, exclaimed Baxter. Come on, boys, gag him. Mr. Smith, however, the lawyer, who had been able to prove his identity to the police commissioner, shouted, frothing with rage. Sir, you dared to afford such a thing? Art thou then the living devil? In the first moment of the tumult, when Raffles, cut off from any possibility of escape, 4 stories high in a fine house seemed already lost, the great unknown had flown with a single leap from the desk to the corner of the room, so that at the same instant he had put a distance between himself and the detective. At the same moment he had something in his hand that no one could discern at first glance. Back! Exclaimed Raffles, at the first step which thou takest, thou art a child of death. Lord Lister's eyes had grown unnaturally large. He stood there threateningly, with arms raised. No one dared to move. Be sensible, Raffles, ventured Baxter in a restless tone. That is of no use. After all, you are in my power. Be calm and wise and surrender. You are advised to do that in your own interest. The Lord's eyes opened wider still, his lips pressed together more tightly. Not a step, I say. He exclaimed again, laughing inwardly like a man who, in complete despair, has been cornered and now shrinks from nothing and no one. Remember, Inspector, if you take one more step, I'll send you all flying into the air together. He stood there, arms raised menacingly. No one dared to answer. All eyes hung on Lord Lister's lips. Smith was also dumb. He couldn't answer either. Baxter gestured that he wanted to approach Raffles, but Raffles again raised his hand. Watch out, Inspector, watch out, or you are a child of death, and put the money on the writing table now, Mr. Smith, put it down at once. Shuddering, the lawyer obeyed. Raffles took the money and withdrew back to the door, behind which he disappeared. Then Baxter made one last attempt. He flew to the door and wanted to push it open. Already he stretched out his hands to Raffles. He held a black object in his hand and now quickly lit a match. It had been only a small effort for Baxter to extinguish this match, but the inspector didn't think otherwise, or in the next instant the whole house would be up in the air. He tumbled back. At the same moment something wonderful happened. The great unknown was suddenly enveloped in smoke and vapor. He was no longer seen. But from where he stood, a glowing shower of sparks shot over to Baxter, and those present stood in the midst of a hissing crowd that terrified them to death. Baxter had fallen to the ground in horror. Smith let out a great cry of terror and fell to the ground too, not thinking otherwise, or he would have to die in the flames. Suddenly the shower of sparks stopped. Baxter crawled to his feet, and the others were soon back on their feet too. The inspector now inquired what had terrified all of them, and he exclaimed furiously, "Raffles has fooled us all with a rocket, such a villain." The detectives looked ashamed at the whole case. When they wanted to visit Raffles, he had of course been gone for a long time. Baxter and Smith scolded each other for all that was ugly, and reproached each other for their cowardly affectation. When Baxter claimed that Raffles could still be overtaken, it was too late. Raffles, meanwhile, had not been idle. He had hastened to Mr. Smith's office, where all the clerks were at work. He imitated the lawyer's voice and cried, "Mr. Brown." "Mr. Smith?" "Open the safe." Raffles saw £10,000 lying in front of him. He hesitated for a moment. "How much do you need to pay the salaries tomorrow?" "It's the 1st, isn't it?" £150. "Correct, £150. You've done a very good job lately. I'll pay you all 6 months' salary." The clerk looked at the alleged lawyer with a grateful look. Raffles put a £1,000 note on the table, pocketed the other 9, and left. When the actual attorney came to the office with Baxter some time later, the money was gone and the thief had flown. Baxter slapped his forehead with his fist. "That Raffles is the first nail in my coffin," he muttered. "I won't make it like that much longer." With a furious gesture, Smith turned to the detective inspector. "After what you've accomplished today, you can safely let yourself be buried," he snapped. This is the inscription of the English Order of the Garter. Chapter 3. The Ribbon Men. Lord Lister sat comfortably in a large armchair in his Victoria Street residence. Across from him, Charlie Brand, his friend and secretary, leaned in an easy chair. "Well," asked Raffles, "have you now found out what kind of club the Ribbon Men is?" "It appears to be a remnant of a secret society formed in Ireland in 1817 to protect the poor tenants from the arbitrariness of the rich landowners." "You are right in looking for a connection between the two," replied Charlie Brand. "I have researched the principal London circles, and have been fortunate enough to give you complete information." "I'm curious about that," said Lord Lister. "The Ribbon Men are a secret society." Lord Lister nodded. "Where is the abode of these modern cattle writers?" "St. James Street No. 39. Lord Lister listened in astonishment. "So, there? Then the gentlemen have already become acquainted with my fists in a less pleasant way." "Why?" "At the time when I spent 6 months as Detective White in Scotland Yard. It does not surprise me in the least that this Sir Warman is a member of the Ribbon Men. That good Mr. Smith, too, belongs, as I have seen from a robe, which I found at his home, and which will enable me to learn more about that club." Lord Lister showed his friend a blood-red cloak, with a hood of the same colour. The dress was as worn by the members of the storehouse in Germany, and the hood had 2 holes for the eyes. A blue ribbon was stitched onto the wide, pleated sleeves, which read, "Honi soit qui mal y pense." "I stole that from Mr. Smith," laughed Lord Lister. "But how do you know that Sir Warman is also a member of that club?" asked Charlie. "I told you then that I once introduced the gentlemen to my fists when they persecuted a young girl. I didn't see anyone because it was too dark, but I immediately recognized Sir Warman by his voice. And you found such a tape in the house of the murdered Madame de Vales? Lord Lister smiled. You mean that would expose the culprit? Tonight I shall see whose mantle this band lacks. One has not yet found a penny of Madame D's fortune Vales, though it was well known that she was very rich, and that she was very well acquainted with Sir Warman. Would that wretch be the murderer of Mrs. Forrester? That's as solid as a wall, dear Charlie. But returning now to the previous matter, I should like to note that some of the banknotes which Mr. Smith voluntarily handed me over, as well as some of those which I found with Sir Warman, were French papers. What misses as for Forrester, it is certain that Sir Warman had a love affair with her 18 years ago. At the time he was still a poor boy, who certainly did not suspect that he would become so influential and wealthy. Among the papers which I found and studied with Mr. Smith, Sir Warman's lawyer, were also a few threatening letters from Mrs. Forrester, who tell of her need. In these letters she informed her former lover that she would now no longer spare him, and that she would expose all his infamy, if he did not finally decide to do something for her and her son. Poor Harry, then, is Sir Warman's son, who at the time when he was with Mrs. Forrester had a liaison, seems to have pulled something off. There will be light on this as well. I have heard that the husband of Mrs. Forrester died suddenly 18 years ago. The young widow was perhaps not quite innocent in that death. She has been sentenced after 17 years. The main culprit, Sir Warman, however, is still at large, and he even dares to exist, to come across and to be here. For fear that Mrs. Forrester could compromise him in her anger and despair, he has succinctly killed her and has calmly envisaged that the boy, suspected of murdering his mother, will be sent to the penitentiary for 20 years. And Mr. Smith, the lawyer? He knew all about it, my dear Charlie. He knew everything, and kept silent. He has even supported the work of his esteemed client as much as he could, for Sir Warman has been very generous with the money he stole from the murdered Madame de Vales. You see, dear Charlie, that this time I have found myself in the company of very venerable persons. The golden clock on the mantelpiece struck 10. Lord Lister lit his cigarette, dressed in the red domino, put on his coat over it, and then said, "It's time." "For what?" "I promised Baxter that within 24 hours I would find the murderer of Mrs. Forrester would extradite. And Baxter must not be allowed to say that I broke my word. You know what you have to do, Charlie. A lot depends on it." "All right," laughed Charlie Brand, "you can rely on me." Lord Lister went out the door, took a carriage and drove to St. James Street. The gentlemen had their club on the 3rd floor. At midnight they gathered. None of the companions could recognize another, all wore crimson robes, the face was completely covered, only the eyes glittered. After all were seated, one of them spoke. "Brothers, according to our custom, I take the oath again, as is the custom of the ribbonman." He held the sword in the air and the other ribbonmen gathered around him. The speaker continued. "Every member of the ribbonmen swears with the most sacred oaths by God and the devil that he will faithfully serve the laws of our club, will submit to all the pronouncements of the allies and will do nothing to harm them. The ribbon men will remain faithful to one another and keep the precepts secret from wife and child, father and mother, sister and brother, fire and wind, and above all that the sun shines, the rain moistens, and what is between heaven and earth. Whoever does not keep the sacred precepts, whoever betrays them, whoever does anything that might harm them, the same will be destroyed by fire, water, or iron, and all the rest of his companions are bound to kill him by means of the water, the fire or the sword." All imitated these words. When this ridiculous and also dangerous ceremony ended, the allies sat down. The leader sat on an elevation, the others gathered around him in a semicircle. "Bring in the invitees." The black-masked servant dragged in a young girl of extraordinary beauty. The captain ordered her to sit down. Mechanically she obeyed. "Your name is Ellen Crofton?" the president began. The girl jumped up and stretched out her hands in a defensive gesture. "Have pity," she prayed in a flattering voice. "Justice shall be done to you, as we shall decide." Listen, what you are accused of by us. There the door was opened and a ribbon man entered, the blue ribbon on his left arm. But what was that? There were already 12 ribbonmen in the hall, the club had only 12 members. And there came a 13th in. Was that a traitor? Or was there already a traitor in the room? That question had to be solved delicately. The chairman, therefore, only coolly returned the greeting of the 13th, who leaned straight against the wall and rested his wide eyes on Lady Crofton. You are accused, said the chairman, that you have not upheld the honor of English women and girls. That you have entered into an affair with a man whose adventures in London have become proverbial. I do not understand you, said the girl. Of whom do you speak? From Sir Warman. Ellen Crofton was startled. Sir Warman? Would I have any relation to Sir Warman? But gentlemen, I can't help it that he has been persecuting me for a few weeks and tormenting me with the proposal to be his wife. I detest him. If the honor of the English women is everywhere as well preserved as it is with me, gentlemen, England may rest easy. Nothing but words. We hold you guilty. You have, moreover, told some scandalous things about a club on St. James Street. You should be punished for that. You must be chastised here in this place. Each one of the members shall inflict 3 lashes on you. Wild joy radiated from the chairman's eyes as he spoke these words. The young girl, however, straightened up and exclaimed, I want to see which of you dares to assault an English woman. Seeing that the masked servants were ready to bind her, she saw only too well that those base words were earnest. She fell to her knees. Mercy! She exclaimed. I am not afraid, but I have done no one any harm. But the immobile, blood-red masks didn't betray what was going on behind them. The servants grabbed Ellen with rough hands. At that very moment one of the men stepped next to Miss Crofton. He made a few arm movements and left and right the 2 masked servants flew against the wall, so that their bones creaked. Now there was some movement among the wretches. The chairman, however, before anything could happen. Keep calm, brothers. One of us seems to find it necessary to intervene for the accused. He can say what he has to say in her defense. Instantly it became quiet. Miss Crofton had grasped the man's knees, as if pleading for help. This young lady, said a somber voice now, is beyond suspicion, and men like you must certainly not venture to raise their hand against her. I do not recognize the chairman, for he has failed to put the blue ribbon on his arm. All eyes turned to the president. Indeed, he was the only one who did not wear the blue ribbon on his left arm. Now all suspicion turned against the chairman. For a moment there was a depressed mood in the matter. Then the 13th continued. Here's the blue ribbon you're missing, sir. While the astonishment of the companions increased, the 13th handed the chairman the blue ribbon, which the latter, as all clearly saw, tied with trembling fingers around his left arm. One of the men came to the 13th and said, Leave that girl to us, and tell us who you are and what your name is. But the 13th only shrugged, and when the ally was about to tear the hood from his head, the stranger hurled him from him with such force that he dragged 3 of his allies to the ground in his pace. At this moment one of the rest bent down to the 13th and whispered to him, You are Raffles. He to whom these words applied turned, looked the masked man in the eye, and answered, You are Inspector Baxter. I'm taking you prisoner, Raffles. Be careful, Baxter, and don't talk too loud. You may not find anyone here to help you. Mr. Smith had told him that the red domino had been stolen from him, and as it was suspected that Raffles, in the lawyer's robes, had went to the club, Baxter had prepared to arrest him there. Baxter withdrew a little. He understood that the club mates would be more likely to help Raffles than a detective inspector. He therefore decided, but to wait until the opportunity was right, to arrest Raffles. One of the men now exclaimed, Let's go fight. I am convinced that the man who opposes our precepts is a traitor. Daggers were drawn and steel flickered on all sides before Raffles' eyes. Back, "If life is dear to you," cried Raffles. And then something very wonderful happened. One of the masked men rallied to the side of the 13th, and as the latter drew his revolver he exclaimed, "Back, this person is under my protection." It was Baxter. Fearing that the red men might steal Raffles from his nose or that they might kill him, he had sided with the man he had long sought. Lord Lister laughed so loudly behind his hood that Baxter heard it. "That is very kind of you, Inspector," he said, "that you have become my friend so suddenly." "Only 5 minutes," replied Baxter angrily. But there suddenly the allies tore their weapons from the wall. At the same moment Lord Lister had drawn a great sword from the wall. He pushed through the men, stood beside the young girl, and cried in a stentorian voice, "I'll show you how Lord Raffles can fight." These words worked like a thunderclap. The arms were laid down and only a few of the bravest dared to attack him. But with an iron fist he beat them all back. It turned into a hot fight. And none of the companions probably would have gotten out of there unscathed, had it not been for a detective who had suddenly appeared behind the doors. "In the name of the law," came a thunderclap. That worked. In an instant the men scattered. During that great confusion Baxter had completely lost sight of Lord Lister. The latter had released Miss Crofton at once and had gone to a door at the back of the hall. Through this door the chairman had disappeared when the 13th had called the name Raffles. He entered a small side room. In the background stood a large iron cupboard, to the right of which hung a portrait depicting Leda with the swan. For a moment Raffles looked about him. He had removed the hood from his head to allow for better breathing. "I bet the gang hid the secret papers here," he whispered. He opened the door with a looper and quickly put the papers with him. Suddenly a figure crept along the ground behind Raffles. When he reached him, he tore the hood from his head. It was Inspector Baxter. "Finally. Thank God. You are under arrest, Raffles." He was just putting the last papers in his pocket. "Inspector, your affection disgusts me," he said, showing him his smiling face. "Didn't I promise you to kill the murderer of Mrs. Forrester to surrender? You must certainly promise me to let me carry out my promise." "The devil promise you that," cried Baxter, extending his hand to Lord Lister. "Once more, in the name of the law." Suddenly the great stranger seized the inspector's domino, shoved a piece of it into the cupboard, then slammed the heavy closing door. "That's low," exclaimed Baxter, who, trying to follow Raffles, slipped and fell on his nose. Raffles meanwhile had disappeared. He flew down the dark corridor. His keen eye immediately understood that the great picture that hung on the wall hid a secret door. Indeed, the picture turned in its frame when he pressed a button and Raffles disappeared into the innermost part of the wall. Finally, Inspector Baxter managed to break free. He was running up and down the hall in despair in search of Raffles, when suddenly a detective came running up. "Inspector!" he cried. "All devils, what's the matter? Help me find Raffles." "I'd like that," the man replied. "Come quickly, Inspector. He's run out into the street. All allies are already on the hunt for him." Furious, Inspector Baxter ran after the detective, who, after taking off their dominoes, led him and the allies down the stairs. By that time Raffles had reached a dark room. There was no exit here, which Raffles noticed at once by the light of an electric flashlight which he lit. Only the president of the society had sought that hiding place. The others had fled in all directions in the first confusion. Lord Lister held the electric lamp before him, which light illuminated the chairman's face. The latter had taken off the hood, and Raffles's wide eyes beheld Sir Warman's face. With clenched fists, Sir Warman stood before his foe. "Rogue! He bit him." Raffles laughed. "You are mistaken about the person, Sir Warman. Or do you still find it necessary that you introduce yourself to me?" "Mirror! Robber! Dog!" roared the chairman, who saw no way out now that he was facing his mortal enemy. "One of us must die," spoke Woman. "That one thou shalt be, Raffles. Thou, My wicked shadow, who dared to begin with me? The Lord laughed again. Then why must one of us die, Sir Warman? Who will be so bloodthirsty? The world is so big that there is still room enough for both of us. Sir Warman breathed again. Then, let me clear the way, Raffles. Now let me through. Lord Lister turned on the lantern, set her on the ground beside him, and answered. I don't think so, Sir Warman. What do you intend, Raffles? I will hand you over to the police. Warman screamed like a beast, the foam was on his lips. Then die, he hissed. His arm swung a great dagger, but Raffles held it so that he dropped the weapon. A fight to the death now ensued in the small room. Raffles, as he was walking backwards, had kicked the lantern to pieces, so that the battle continued in utter darkness. By applying the Japanese method of wrestling, Raffles finally succeeded in subduing his heavy opponent. In vain Sir Warman begged for mercy. You only get what you deserve, scoundrel, said Lord Lister. He tied the hands of his vanquished adversary tightly. Carefully, Raffles opened a secret door. He looked around. There was no one to be seen. Raffles took a business card from his pocket and wrote on it in pencil. Dear Inspector Baxter, as I promised you, I hereby hand you over the murderer of Mrs. Forrester and Madame de Vales and her maid, John C. Raffles. He then took off the red domino that was raged from his body, took hat and stick, and hung his coat around his shoulders. At that very moment the detective stood before him, whose appearance had scattered the party. You can't go down yet, Raffles, they're still looking for you. You have done your duty well, Charlie, said Raffles. I will now wait until the daybreak and then get out of here. Until that long I belong to the Order of the Garter too. My name is Lord Westminster, dear Charlie, isn't that dignified? Charlie Brand laughed heartily. He went downstairs, where Baxter was still standing. Have you seen the fugitive, detective? No, Inspector, I think he ran off and sought shelter in the Jockey Club for so long. But Inspector Baxter didn't mind these words and ran back up the stairs. Charlie Brand looked after him, shaking his head. As long as things don't go wrong, he said in a concerned tone. Chapter 4. A visit to Ben, the Minister of Finance of the Three United Kingdoms. Lord Westminster. The servant cried out in a louder voice through the hall, and he bowed deeply to Lord Raffles, who, adorned with the Order of the Garter, entered the great club room. Some of the gentlemen present looked up, but most did not care about the new guest. Lord Lister would have known what he was doing when he chose this name. The Lord was somewhat like him, and had gone on a journey for 2 years. Yet the game was extremely dangerous, for he needed only to meet a good acquaintance of the Lord's to be lost. Lord Lister sat down at the gaming table. At a small roulette sat 7 noblemen between 20 and 40 years of age. The game had just stopped when Lord Westminster sat down on one of the empty chairs. I assure you, Marquis, said Earl Westbury, it is impossible but to glance into the treasury where the knighthoods of the King of England are kept. They are worth innumerable millions. The Marquis, an elegant Frenchman, stroked his well-groomed moustache once. You do not know the vigilance of our police and of the men who guard the treasury in the royal palace, interposed Lord Rathsbourne. Not even Raffles, the master thief, would succeed in stealing one of these knighthoods, said a third. Raffles? Lord Westminster joined in the conversation. Who is Raffles? I have just come from the journey and am hearing that name for the first time. New nobility. The gentleman laughed. Don't you know, Lord, who Raffles is? But then you don't know London anymore. Raffles is everything. Raffles is London in person. A famous guy. But, as said, he would not even get the knighthoods of the king. Lord Westminster looked at his watch. It's 1:30 now, isn't it? Well, sirs, I make sure I stole all those knighthoods in 24 hours. The gentlemen opened their eyes wide. But Lord, that's a joke? Lord Westminster, however, spoke. I bet £50,000. There was silence for a moment. Then, however, the gentlemen decided to take the bet together. So £50,000, if I bring you the knighthoods of the King of England in 24 hours, said Lord Lister. At that moment a new guest sat down with me. You have forgotten me, Lord, he said. Raffles looked up and saw Baxter's angry face. The two looked at each other for a second. The gentleman looked at the newcomer whom the porter had called his name with some suspicion. Lord Lister had all the good manners of a man of the world, and his high nobility, Lord Westminster, had at once made the lords in common with him. But this newbie? Who was that? An intruder? A conman? What was he supposed to do? Now, Count Pollen, how much do you put? Raffles asked the inspector with a calm countenance. Count Pollen. That changed. The gentleman understood that a good acquaintance of Lord Westminster must be an aristocrat. I'll bet £1 million, Lord, you can't win your bet. It was a great carelessness on Baxter's part that he mentioned a sum of which no one believed. £1 million. 12 million guilders. No one in Jockey Club believed for a moment that Lord Pollen could wager 12 million guilders. When mistrust rose again, Raffles immediately seized the opportunity to salvage his stance. I understand you can risk such a sum, you are Raffles. So it's no art to you. Those words hit. The gentlemen sprang up as if stung by a wasp. They looked at Baxter with their necks stretched. This one was completely bewildered. The thief's trick had come so unexpectedly that at the first moment he could not say a word. Raffles, however, at once spoke. It is best to call a detective at once. This man is Raffles, I recognize him clearly. A servant flew down the stairs to call a detective. Meanwhile Baxter had regained his presence of mind. It's a scandal. There is Raffles, he exclaimed. He pointed to Lord Westminster, who stood beside him with a scornful shrug. He wanted to gag Lord Westminster, but he punched him. We must bind the madman, he said, if we do not want the name of our club to be compromised in all the papers tomorrow. Meanwhile servants had come to bind the alleged master thief. At this moment the detective entered. Detective, cried Baxter, tell these gentlemen that the wretch standing there, and calling himself Lord Westminster, is Raffles. The detective looked first at Raffles and then at the inspector. Then he pointed to Baxter and said, yes, that's Raffles. It was truly astonishing that Baxter did not have a stroke. He was dragged away by the servant, and Raffles turned to the rest of the gentlemen, saying, I'm going home now, gentlemen, to make up my mind, for the low tricks of that rascal have seized me after all. And then, gentlemen, remember our bet. Raffles disappeared. The gentlemen discussed the case for some time, and then some remembered that Lord Westminster was indeed so much like Raffles. They came to the conclusion that deception was indeed at play here, and that the intruder had indeed been Raffles, who had played a nasty trick on the inspector. When, some time later, the detectives, summoned by Baxter, arrived, it was evident how great the deception had been. Charlie Brand, who had served as a detective, had saved his friend once again. Baxter, already at large, hastened at once to warn the Secretary of the Treasury of Raffles's schemes, and hid in the Secretary's office with a fully loaded pistol. Baxter had been at his post for 12 hours without the slightest incident. The afternoon passed. Dusk was already falling, and a wonderful autumn evening followed. From the garden of the palace the splashing of a spring came into the room, which was grandly furnished with furniture in purple. There was a telephone on the writing table. On the green sheet was a small ivory knob, like an electric bell. When this was pressed, a secret trapdoor opened in the floor in front of the writing table. In this way they entered the treasury, where the knighthoods of the King of England were kept. And Inspector Baxter kept waiting, while he was hungry and thirsty, as he re-examined his pistol and looked into the moonlit garden. And Raffles, against whom all these measures had been taken, took the simplest course there was. At 11 o'clock in the evening, the Minister of Finance was notified of the visit of the State Attorney. This was nothing special. The minister, unsure whether a snare was being set here, stopped at his table, on which lay the pistols. The servant opened the door. Into a splendid evening dress, the ribbon of the Order of the Garter under the left knee, the gold-brimmed prom hat in the left hand, entered an elegant, distinguished young man of about 30 years of age. He bowed, waited for the servant to close the door behind him, took a few steps towards the minister, and then said, "My name is Raffles." The minister was so astonished at this insolence that he forgot to press the bell and call the servant. He mechanically reached for his revolver. "Ah, Excellency, leave that alone," said Raffles, making himself as comfortable as possible. "I'm always used to working without a revolver. It is much more pleasant if one does not always immediately take up arms." The minister recovered as far as he could in his position. He was convinced that this person could not possibly harm him so long as he was so far from him, as he was now. He breathed widely. He also hoped to keep Raffles close to him until Inspector Baxter, as had been arranged, would come here of his own accord in the den. Then it would no longer be difficult to overwhelm the mysterious man who looked like an aristocrat and turned out to be a criminal. "Ha!" The minister shivered. "And Lord Lister?" He never lost his stereotypical smile. "How can I really be of service to you?" then asked the man, who was nailed to his chair by the magnetic gaze of Raffles. "I wanted to chat a little with you about the knighthoods of the King of England." "That is a subject which does not bring me much joy," said the minister, shyly. "So?" laughed Raffles, "that is a pity. Can I serve you with a cigarette?" This one was a passionate smoker. He took one of the cigarettes offered, constantly looking anxiously at the doorman in the background. "Is there perhaps a secret door to the treasury?" asked Raffles. The minister was terrified that he had betrayed himself by his look, and replied, "You are mistaken. But what do you wish? Thou art the most dangerous man of our age. At the slightest movement you make, I'll shoot you." Lord Lister always smiled and answered, sticking a cigarette between his teeth, "Is it permitted?" At the same time, he took the golden smoking set toward him. The minister, afraid of a trick, hastily grabbed the smoking device himself. He lit a match and held it for Raffles's cigarette. Then the minister looked at his watch. Thank God. The police inspector, with whom he had a secret agreement, could not stay away much longer. Raffles, meanwhile, smoked his cigarette in silence. The minister watched him from the side as fine blue puffs of smoke curled upwards. It was a wonderful, comical state. That Raffles was a wonderful fellow. He just sat there dead calm. He even seemed to be waiting for Baxter to come and arrest him. Wonderful, such a man. Highly comical. That was the last thing the minister thought, then he had gone to sleep. The lit cigarette had fallen to the floor. Raffles put down his prom hat, picked up the cigarette and tossed it into the ashtray. "Morphine in tobacco is an excellent sedative," he grumbled. Laughing, he looked at the minister, who began to snore. Then he opened the writing table, took out the key, went to the doors, opened the secret door by a spring, and disappeared into the dark corridor leading to the treasury. His searcher's eye, illuminated by the gleam of an electric flashlight, had soon found the doors, passageways, and trapdoors which led him to the room where he was to be, and when, in the lapse of 15 minutes, he had opened many secret entrances, had crawled through cupboards and cleared all obstacles, he stood in a room where there was a huge cupboard. As he had done in Warman's house at that time, so he did now with the steel door. And when it was opened, Raffles gazed upon such splendor of gold and diamonds and precious things as even he had never seen in his life. There on a black ribbon lay a white star encased in gold, a gold crown within, and above it a gold helmet, armor and gun barrel, the cross of the Malteser order. Smiling, Raffles took the thing and put it on his chest. This was followed by the simple, but no less expensive Danebrock order, the white cross with 5 golden crowns. Suum quicque to each his own, he read on the Prussian Order of the Black Eagle. It actually suits me. To each his own, that's my motto too. The Greek Order of the Saviour, a snow-white cross with a blue-rimmed gold ring in the center and the effigy of the Saviour, worn by a golden crown on a blue ribbon, hung Raffles about his neck. It was all a glitter and glitter of fairy tale splendor. The Order of St. Anne of Russia, a red cross with gold, a German knighthood, a long, black cross, the mighty Turkish Order of Mejidi, the Order of the Garter, the great English Order of Michaels and Georges, all those beautiful treasures, those wonderful decorations, stabbed Raffles on his chest. A sea of gold and light shone through each other. Finally Raffles took the last, most important, principal orders of the world, the Austrian and Spanish orders of the Golden Fleece. In a large, heavy frame, set in gold, with a green background, hung under a scalloped red leaf, also set in gold, a solid gold sheep. Slowly, with a mysterious smile on his lips, Raffles leaned against the closet door. Then he went to the writing table and lit a cigarette. Suddenly a tall, thin figure loomed in front of Raffles. It was Baxter. "Finally!" exclaimed the inspector, "now your game is over, Raffles." He smiled and continued to smoke. Baxter took out his revolver. "Don't go any farther, or I'll shoot you." The two men stood face to face, motionless. They remained in the same position in silence for seconds. Raffles broke the silence first. "Why do you keep blaming yourself, dear Inspector? After all, you can never arrest me." "You are mistaken, Raffles, this time you are in trouble. And beware. Otherwise you are a child of death." But Raffles was still smiling. "All devils!" he exclaimed, "it is almost midnight. I have to be at the Jockey Club at 1:30 if I want to win my bet." "Thou shalt not win her," exclaimed the inspector triumphantly. "Oh yes, it is." "Never." However, in a flash, Raffles had gone to the writing desk. Baxter aimed his revolver. "Back, Raffles." "I'm never going back, remember that," said Raffles, pressing the ivory button. The trapdoor opened silently and Baxter sank into the depths with lightning speed. The shot went off in the air and the inspector disappeared into the treasure room. "Hello, Inspector Baxter, where is the journey going?" laughed John Raffles, releasing the ivory button. The master thief now went to the writing table and wrote the following. To H.E., the Minister of Finance. In order to spare your friend, Detective Baxter's inspector, further unpleasant hours in the deep treasury, I hereby inform you that I kindly, but urgently, asked me to go there, that he might not hinder me in the carrying out of my purpose. So open the cellar and give Baxter his freedom back. Your servant, John C. Raffles. He then left the room through the great glass door, passed through the garden, and leapt over the high wall of the Royal Park, the very moment the minister awoke and sounded the alarm. Chapter 5. The Mysterious Carriage. Lord Lister called a cab. The coachman greeted the elegant gentleman politely, whose splendid knighthoods shone through the half-opened coat. Jockey Club, Street James Street. It went on. The great club room opened, and an elegant, distinguished young man entered. But not only his splendid appearance, but also the splendor of the splendid knighthoods made all eyes fix on him. And like wildfire it went from mouth to mouth. Raffles. The master thief bowed politely to the Earl of Westbury, who looked up as if petrified. Lord Rathspawn clutched his monocle. All you bastards. Are you indeed? But that is not possible. Lord Lister smiled again. I won the bet, gentlemen. All had to convince themselves that the orders of chivalry were real. Not one was missing. If I were not a modern man I should believe in witchcraft, said the Earl of Westbury. Lord Rathspawn, however, added. We lost our bet. Nobody contradicted that. The club members were all nobles. They had lost their bet. And without saying a word, they took out their wallets and paid. Thank you, gentlemen. said Raffles. He put the money away. And now you must be so good as to see that all those beautiful things are put back in their proper place. He carefully removed all knighthoods and gave them to the Earl of Westbury. Then he went. His cab was still waiting downstairs. He drove near his house and continued on foot. Charlie Brand waited in his house, to whom he told his adventure. Raffles then disappeared into a side room, and after a while reappeared as an elegant London coachman. Then he went to the stable, harnessed the horse himself, and led the carriage. He then got in. Bromley Burdett Road, Charlie. All right. As Raffles drove to Miss Ellen Crofton's house, the gentlemen in the club had come to the conclusion that it would be better if the police took Raffles back and gave them back. The Earl of Westbury rose with a solemn gesture. He took long steps to the telephone. Scotland Yard, ma'am. Hello, yes. You speak to the Jockey Club. What do you wish? I just want to tell you that Raffles was here. Who, what, how? Raffles, the master thief. Just as the Earl telephoned this wonderful news to Scotland Yard, Inspector Baxter arrived. The inspector cursed. He raged and roared. And he claimed for the umpteenth, certainly the 100th time, that Raffles was driving him mad. He was indeed half mad with anger and annoyance. No sooner had he received the telephonic message from the Earl of Westbury than he ordered, though himself exhausted and barely able to keep himself going, that 5 detectives should follow him. He himself hurriedly jumped on his bicycle and like nocturnal ghosts the 6 policemen chased through the darkness. Colonel Crofton lived with his family in a small house consisting of 4 fairly large rooms, simply furnished. The colonel was a man of about 50 years of age. He was still resilient and spirited, but a serious injury forced him to lean on a stick as he walked. A pair of sensible dark blue eyes peered out from beneath blonde eyebrows, and the blushing face had a pleasing expression. His hair was still beautifully curly, and his mouth had a proud, but not idiosyncratic expression. Just as Lister rang the bell, he heard a crackling voice from beyond the door. Sir Warman no longer gives you credit. I'll close your business tomorrow if you don't pay today. But if I don't have any money, Popalapup, pay or out. I beg you. Sir Warman is willing to meet you somewhat, if you will please him. If that's in my power, I'd love to. Your daughter, Miss Ellen, will be heard as a witness tomorrow. Much depends on her statements. She might make the matter look a little less serious, you see. There sounded the bell. Miss Ellen herself answered. When she looked into Lord Lister's face, she let out a cry of joy. Daddy, she cried, there is the man who has defended me so selflessly. The colonel approached Raffles. The gentlemen greeted each other warmly. Raffles, however, soon turned to the strange man. Who are you? I am Sir Warman's agent. Then you have a nice job, say, agent of a murderer. MRRRR. The other howled. See these muscles, sir. Be careful that I don't introduce you to it. But even before the agent had acted on his intention, Raffles had punched him in the chin, sending him flying backwards like a rubber ball. What do you really want from me? Asked the agent. I want to tell you to tell Sir Warman that Miss Ellen will only speak the truth in the testimony. And further, Colonel Crofton will continue his business in the same vein. But the money? Raffles snatched the receipt from the man's hand. How big is that amount? The agent was dumbfounded. £200 with the £475 from last time. So that's £675 together. Here they are. But, began the other. Raffles pointed to the hallway door. Not a word now and out. The guy snuck off like a beaten dog. The colonel seized the hands of his benefactor. How can I thank you? Your friendship is enough reward for me. Can I perhaps be of service to you? Now asked Miss Ellen in a shy tone. Thank you enough for your tears, lady. I will pray for you daily. What's your name? He shook his head. Don't ask. I represent happiness and fate. He bowed and left the house. 37 Western Street, Raffles ordered aloud. Charlie Brand leaned over to him. Baxter is here with 5 detectives. They are hiding. Raffles laughed. Go on, coachman. The door flew shut. Simultaneously, 6 figures emerged from the mist. They jumped on their bicycles and continued to ride beside the carriage, so that it was impossible for Raffles to leave the carriage. After a journey of 3/4 of an hour they arrived at their goal. Baxter ordered his men to dismount. We'll capture him upstairs in the house. It had been a good idea from Baxter to drive to Bromley. Surely this time Raffles would not escape him. It's a long wait, said one of the detectives. The others agreed. At last Baxter approached the carriage with a loaded revolver. He opened the door. Come out, Raffles, you are my prisoner, he said, but at the same time he stepped back in terror. He cursed heavily. Coachman. Yes, sir. Where's Raffles? Charlie Brand laughed. Where is Raffles? I'm not Inspector Baxter, am I? He always knows where Raffles is. No kidding. Thou hast ridden Raffles. No matter. My question was the famous magician Ben Akiba. Watch out, I'll have you arrested if you're kidding me. I don't take you for a fool, really. But Baxter took Charlie in his carriage to Scotland Yard, where the young man told that he had joined Lord Westminster a few days ago. But Lord Westminster is Raffles, said Baxter. So? Asked Charlie with a silly face, is that true? I really didn't know that. Baxter couldn't hurt him and let him go again. When Charlie had ridden some distance, he got off the box. It's a good thing that Baxter didn't examine the carriage further, then he would have noticed that the bottom is sliding. And Raffles? When the carriage was escorted by the detectives, he had carefully pushed aside the floor and let himself slide between the wheels until he stood on the ground. Then he waved his hand to the detectives and exclaimed, Goodbye, Inspector Baxter. See you next time. He then entered a cafe. The end. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.